The restaurant's air was heavy with the scent of butter, truffle oil, and fine wine. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead, scattering light across white linen tables where Manhattan's elite sat sipping cocktails and murmuring in polished tones. Every movement was rehearsed elegance, waiters gliding with trays balanced like crowns, soft piano music curling through the air. It was the kind of place where shoes shone like mirrors, where the smallest imperfection would be noticed, whispered about, and judged. And then she walked in. A small figure, almost ghost-like at first glance. A girl, 7, maybe 8, barefoot, her toes raw from the cold pavement outside. Her hair tangled, her face thin, but her eyes burned with a hunger that was more than just for food. They were wide and searching, desperate yet strangely determined, as if some invisible force had carried her inside. A few customers gasped softly, offended by her presence. Others simply turned their heads away, as if ignoring her might erase her from their evening. "Hey, hey!" The voice snapped like a whip across the room. Manager Thomas Fletcher stormed forward, his polished shoes striking against the marble floor. His jaw was set, his eyes sharp with annoyance. "I told you, people like you are not allowed here." His hand clamped down on the girl's arm, rough and dismissive. She flinched under the force, her small body trembling, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she lifted her chin, her breath shallow, and looked past him. The clink of silverware stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. The hum of the restaurant froze. Her gaze locked onto a man seated alone at a corner table. He was the only black man in the room, dressed in an immaculate tailored suit, his posture calm, his presence commanding even in silence. He didn't need to move to draw attention. He was the kind of man who carried authority. Like a second skin, Michael Washington, 42 years old, a name whispered in boardrooms, the CEO of one of the most powerful tech companies in the country. The girl's lips trembled, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to cut through the silence. "Can I eat with you, Daddy?" The words dropped like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the room. Gasps, sharp and audible, broke the air. A woman at the nearest table set down her glass too hard, the stem cracking under pressure. A couple exchanged scandalized glances. Waiters froze mid-step, their trays hovering like suspended time. Fletcher's grip on her arm tightened, his face flushed with anger. "What did you just—" But Michael's eyes had already lifted, and the weight of his gaze was enough to silence the manager mid-sentence. The girl's small frame shook, but she didn't look away. Hunger had driven her in here, but something deeper had made her speak those words. Maybe it was the way he looked different from everyone else. Maybe it was the quiet strength in his face, or the loneliness she saw in the way he sat alone with untouched food. Whatever it was, in that moment she believed enough to call him Daddy. The silence was unbearable, stretching like a taut string ready to snap. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed on the man in the corner, waiting to see what he would do. Would he dismiss her, send her back to the cold streets? Or would he, impossibly, accept her plea? Michael set down his fork with deliberate calm. His movements were measured, but behind his stillness was something brewing, something no one in that room could yet see. And in that pause, in that breath of quiet, hearts beat faster, the air thick with expectation. The story had already begun. The silence did not break quickly. It lingered, thick and uncomfortable, like smoke in the air. The girl's words hung above the table, caught between disbelief and scandal. All around, patrons shifted uneasily, some whispering to one another, others staring openly as if they had just witnessed an act of blasphemy in their sanctuary of wealth. Michael Washington didn't flinch. His hand rested lightly on the tablecloth, his eyes fixed on the child. In those eyes, he saw something raw, something he hadn't seen in years. Hunger, yes, but not only for food. Hunger for recognition, for dignity, for someone to see her as more than the dirt on her bare feet. Fletcher, the manager, sputtered, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "Mr. Washington, with all due respect, this child has no place here. She needs to leave before she disturbs the other guests." His tone was clipped, but underneath it lay panic. He could feel the room watching him as much as they were watching Michael. But Michael wasn't looking at Fletcher. He was watching the girl. She trembled, her small body still caught in the manager's grip, but her eyes did not waver. She stared at him as though her entire world hinged on his answer. Her lips moved again, barely audible this time, but clear enough for him to hear. "Please." A memory flickered in Michael's mind. A boy no older than she was, standing in the corner of a cramped kitchen 30 years ago, waiting for his mother to bring him whatever scraps were left from her long day working as a maid. That boy had known hunger. That boy had learned silence in rooms where he didn't belong. That boy had grown into the man who now sat at the corner table of one of the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan. The sting of those years returned in a rush, colliding with the present moment. "Let her go," Michael said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, the kind of tone that made even the clatter of a dropped spoon freeze mid-air. Fletcher hesitated. "Sir, this child—" "I said," Michael repeated, his eyes never leaving the girl's. "Let her go." Slowly, reluctantly, Fletcher released her arm. She stumbled slightly, rubbing the red mark on her wrist, but her gaze remained locked on Michael. For the first time since entering the room, her shoulders relaxed just a fraction, as if she had been waiting all her life for someone to answer her call. Around them, the murmurs grew louder. A man in a tailored gray suit leaned toward his wife, whispering harshly. A silver-haired woman scoffed audibly, her disgust written across her face. The restaurant's carefully maintained facade of exclusivity was cracking, and no one knew what would happen next. Michael leaned back in his chair, his movements unhurried, almost deliberate. "You said you wanted to eat with me?" The girl nodded slowly, unsure if she should believe him. "Then come," he said, pulling out the chair beside him. "Sit here." A gasp rippled across the room. Fletcher's face went crimson. "Mr. Washington, this is highly inappropriate." But Michael raised a hand, silencing him. His gaze never wavered from the child. "Tell me your name, sweetheart." "Aisha," she whispered. He nodded once, as if sealing something unspoken. "Well, Aisha, tonight you're my guest." And with those words, the air in the restaurant shifted. The tension did not disappear, it grew heavier, but beneath it was something else. Suspense. The sense that everything that would follow from this moment was going to change more than just one girl's evening. It was going to change the balance of power in the room. Michael picked up his menu and, without breaking eye contact with Fletcher, slid another one across to the girl. "Choose whatever you like." The restaurant, polished and pitite, effect just moments ago, now felt like the stage for something no one had rehearsed for. And no one, not even Fletcher, could guess what Michael Washington was about to do next. The hush inside the restaurant was almost unbearable. The chandeliers still glowed, the piano still played, but the air felt tense, heavy, as though the entire room was holding its breath. Aisha sat stiffly in the chair Michael had pulled out for her, her bare feet dangling above the polished marble floor. She pressed her small hands together on the edge of the table, afraid to move, afraid to believe this might be real. Michael's face remained calm, but his eyes carried a weight no one in that room could measure. He picked up the heavy leather menu and slid it across to her with the care of a father tucking a blanket around his child. "Go on," he said gently. "Look, tonight you get to choose." Aisha blinked at the menu, her fingers hesitating as though she wasn't allowed to touch something so fine. The gilded lettering, the strange names, the endless numbers, each one more intimidating than the last, blurred before her eyes. She whispered, "Can I really?" Her voice was fragile, yet it carried through the stillness. Michael leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "Yes, sweetheart, anything. A princess deserves the best, doesn't she?" The word stunned her. Princess. No one had ever called her that. Not on the street corners where she had begged for coins, not in the shelters where she had curled up under thin blankets. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and stared at the pages, her lips moving as she tried to sound out the dishes she didn't understand. From nearby tables came muffled scoffs. A man in a pinstripe suit muttered, "Ridiculous." His wife shook her head, whispering something about standards. A group of younger professionals laughed under their breath, one of them taking out his phone, pretending to snap a photo. The atmosphere was thick with disdain, every whisper sharp as glass. Thomas Fletcher, the manager, had been standing frozen in disbelief. "Hey." His face a mask of fury barely hidden behind forced composure. Finally, he stepped forward, his voice low but pointed. "Mr. Washington, with respect, this isn't proper. She doesn't belong here. We have policies, rules for admission." Michael did not look at him. He kept his gaze fixed on Aisha, who was tracing the picture of a golden fish dish with her fingertip. "And what kind of rules are those, Mr. Fletcher?" Michael's tone was calm, but it cut through the air like a blade. Fletcher faltered, his mouth opening and closing. "We maintain an environment for a certain clientele," he stammered. "People who appreciate our values." Michael's lips curved slightly, though it wasn't a smile. "Interesting." His hand slid casually across the table, his thumb brushing the side of his phone screen. Quietly, the device began recording. Aisha finally looked up, her eyes wide with wonder. "Can I have this one?" she asked, pointing at the golden fish with the special potatoes. The most expensive dish on the menu. Michael's eyes softened instantly. "Of course, sweetheart, that one." The waiter, who had been standing a few steps away, froze in hesitation. His eyes darted to Fletcher, silently begging for instruction. Fletcher's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists. "Sir," Fletcher tried again, his voice strained, "surely you can see how inappropriate this is. You'll make the other guests uncomfortable." At the table beside them, an older woman with diamonds at her neck gave a loud, pointed sigh. "Frankly, it's an embarrassment," she declared. Her husband leaned in, whispering harshly, "Manager, end this, quickly." Aisha flinched at their words, her small shoulders hunching as though she wanted to disappear into the chair. She whispered to Michael, barely audible, "Did I do something wrong?" The quiet question pierced through him like a blade. Michael's jaw tightened, his calm mask shifting just slightly. He reached across the table, placing his hand lightly on hers. "No, sweetheart, you did nothing wrong. Don't ever believe that." And for the first time that evening, his eyes lifted from the girl and locked directly on Fletcher's. The calmness was still there, but beneath it burned something dangerous, something no one in that restaurant had ever seen in him before. Michael's voice came low, steady, but with an authority that pressed down on the room like weight. "Bring her the dish, the golden fish with special potatoes, and bring her a glass of water, now." The waiter glanced again at Fletcher, frozen in indecision. Fletcher's face darkened, his lips twitching as though he wanted to protest further, but something in Michael's gaze held him back. Something unshakable, something final. For the first time in years, Michael Washington wasn't just enduring the whispers, the stares, the subtle humiliations. He was ready to answer them, and the room knew it. The golden glow of the chandeliers no longer seemed warm. It felt harsh now, exposing every glance, every whisper, every ounce of contempt that filled the room. The air inside the restaurant had turned into a stage, and everyone knew they were watching something that would not be forgotten. Michael sat still, his posture perfect, his gaze steady on Aisha. The waiter, after one last uncertain look at Fletcher, scurried away toward the kitchen. The menu still rested on the table, but the choice had already been made. Aisha leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you sure it's okay?" Michael turned his head, studying her delicate face, the hope flickering in her eyes, the fear pressed tight in her small shoulders. "Yes," he said softly. "It's more than okay. Tonight, you'll eat like a princess." The words rolled across the restaurant like an invisible thunderclap. People stared, frowning, muttering into their napkins. A few exchanged outraged looks, as if the very idea of a homeless child eating at their table was an offense to their world. It was then that Margaret Thornfield decided she could no longer contain herself. Draped in silk, diamonds catching the light, she leaned back in her chair, her voice sharp and loud enough for the room to hear. "This is absurd. We don't pay thousands of dollars to dine beside this kind of spectacle." Gasps whispered across the tables. Aisha shrank into her chair, her hands pulling toward her lap as if she could disappear. Michael's eyes flicked toward Margaret, calm but sharp, like a surgeon preparing an incision. "What kind of spectacle is that, madam?" His tone was measured, his voice low, but the authority in it was undeniable. Margaret arched an eyebrow, emboldened by the silence around her. "Don't play coy. You bring a child like that, dirty, barefoot, clearly out of place, into an establishment like this? It's charity theater, nothing more." The words cut through Aisha like glass. Her breath trembled, her chest rising quickly, and for the first time she looked away, her courage folding under the weight of open cruelty. She whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Maybe I shouldn't be here." Michael's hand moved across the table, steady, strong. He placed it over hers, firm but gentle, grounding her back to the moment. His voice softened, not for the others, but for her alone. "Don't listen to that. You belong anywhere you choose to be. Don't ever doubt that." But then his eyes lifted again, this time locking onto Margaret's with an intensity that made her flinch just for a second. "Charity?" Michael said, his tone rising enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear. "No, madam, this is not charity. This is dinner. A child asked for food and I said yes. If that offends you, perhaps the problem is not at this table." The silence afterward was cutting. Even the piano music faltered for a moment, as if the keys themselves had frozen. Fletcher, red-faced and sweating, tried to regain control. He stepped closer, his voice sharp, strained with authority. "Mr. Washington, please understand. We must maintain an atmosphere for our traditional clientele. This is not a soup kitchen. This is Le Bernardin." Michael's expression did not change, but something in his eyes hardened, a flicker of fire long held back. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands together on the table, his tone sharp with calm precision. "Atmosphere, standards, traditional clientele." He repeated the words slowly, savoring them, as though each one revealed more than Fletcher meant it to. "Tell me, Mr. Fletcher, what exactly do those words mean? Be specific." The manager's throat bobbed. His lips twitched as if searching for safer ground, but no safe ground existed anymore. The room leaned in, curious and unsettled, waiting to hear what excuse he would offer. Before Fletcher could answer, Aisha's small voice pierced the tension again. "Daddy," she whispered, the word trembling but brave. "Did I do something wrong?" Michael turned to her, his expression softening instantly. "No, sweetheart, you did everything right." Then his gaze shifted back to Fletcher, colder now, sharper, unrelenting. "It seems others here are the ones struggling with wrong." The waiter returned then, carrying a silver tray with the golden fish dish glistening under the lights. Steam rising delicately, the smell rich and intoxicating. The presentation was flawless, the kind of dish that cost more than a week's rent in half the city. He set it before Aisha with forced elegance, his hands trembling. Aisha's eyes widened, her small fingers hovering over the polished utensils. She had never seen food look like this, never smelled anything so rich, never felt this close to belonging. Michael smiled gently at her. "Go on, eat." The room was watching. Every eye locked on her, every whisper buzzing like electricity, every moment stretched taut with judgment. But Aisha picked up the fork, her hand shaking, and took the first bite. And in that single act, simple, small, yet defiant, everything in the room shifted again. Michael leaned back in his chair, his voice quiet but every syllable deliberate. "Now," he said, fixing Fletcher with a stare that froze him in place, "let's talk about these standards of yours." The trap was being set, and no one, not Fletcher, not Margaret, not anyone in that restaurant, realized just how close they were to the moment that would change everything. The restaurant's light shimmered against polished silver and crystal, but for Michael Washington, it felt like a spotlight aimed at wounds long hidden. As Aisha chewed slowly, her wide eyes fixed on the golden fish before her, the world around them seemed to dissolve for a moment. The whispers, the stares, the disgust, they faded. What remained was the fragile sound of a child tasting food she had only dreamed of. But her trembling hand, the way she kept glancing around as if afraid someone would snatch it away, struck something deep in him. Michael leaned back, his gaze steady on her, and without meaning to, he slipped into memory. He saw himself at her age, in a cramped kitchen where the wallpaper peeled like shedding skin. His mother, exhausted from her second job, scraping together beans and bread for him and his siblings. He remembered the shame of carrying that smell of poverty into school, the humiliation of classmates sneering when he couldn't afford lunch, the sting of being invisible in rooms that measured worth by skin color and by bank balance. He swallowed hard, pushing down the memory, but the weight pressed harder than usual. Across the table, Aisha wiped her mouth with the napkin clumsily, imitating the refined movements of the guests she had watched from afar. She wasn't just eating, she was studying, absorbing, trying to fit into a world that had always slammed its doors in her face. Michael's chest tightened, her voice pulled him back. "My grandma used to say, we're all princes and princesses, even if the world can't see our crowns." She looked down quickly, as if embarrassed to have spoken aloud. "But it's hard to believe when you're hungry." The words hit him with the force of a hammer. He saw the truth in her eyes, the quiet strength that hunger hadn't stolen, the belief that flickered even when the world tried to snuff it out. At the table, beside them, Margaret Thornfield let out a sharp laugh. "Princess, oh please, spare us the fairy tales. Some people are born to polish silver, not hold it." The words slashed through the air, cruel and deliberate. Aisha flinched, her fork clattering against the plate, her eyes watering. She blinked rapidly, trying not to cry because she had learned tears earned her nothing on the streets. Michael's jaw tightened, the calm mask over his face trembling at the edges. He inhaled slowly, centering himself, but inside, fire roared. He had tolerated whispers for years, absorbed insults with silence, walked away from battles he could have won, because timing mattered more than impulse. Now that patience was running out. Aisha's small voice cut the silence again, trembling but brave. "Daddy, do I really belong here?" The question broke something in him. The vulnerability in her tone, the desperate need for an answer, it echoed his own unspoken question from decades ago. Did he belong? Could someone like him sit at these tables without being reminded he was unwelcome? He reached across the table, steadying her shaking hand with his own. His voice was low, filled with a steel no one in that room had ever heard from him before. "You belong anywhere your feet take you, Aisha. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The room bristled with discomfort, but Michael didn't care. He had said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Fletcher, who had been hovering nearby, tried once again to seize control. "Mr. Washington, I'm warning you, this is not how things are done. If you insist on pushing this, you'll leave me no choice but to call security." Michael turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Fletcher's with an intensity that made the man falter mid-sentence. He set his napkin down with surgical precision, his every movement deliberate, rehearsed, powerful. "Security?" Michael's voice was calm, almost too calm. "For what crime exactly? A child asking for food, or a black man refusing to be silent?" The restaurant froze. Even the piano player's fingers hesitated over the keys. The tension was electric, impossible to ignore. Michael leaned forward slightly, his words precise, deliberate. "You see, Mr. Fletcher, the thing about silence is this. It gives men like you the illusion of safety. But silence doesn't mean blindness, it doesn't mean acceptance." His eyes narrowed. "And it doesn't last forever." Aisha stared at him, her small hand still under his, her chest rising with shaky breaths. For the first time since she'd entered the restaurant, a flicker of safety crossed her face. The trap was tightening, though no one else could see it yet. The years of humiliation Michael had endured in this very place had not been wasted. Every slight, every whispered insult had been recorded, catalogued, filed away. Tonight, the ledger was about to be opened, and soon, the world would know the cost of their arrogance. The tension inside La Bernardine had thickened to the point that even the clinking of glasses sounded like breaking glass. Guests shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable, restless, whispering among themselves, but their eyes never left the table in the corner. That was where the storm had gathered, quiet yet heavy, centered on one barefoot child and the man who had dared to let her sit at his side. Aisha kept her head lowered, her fork trembling in her small hand. She chewed slowly, her eyes darting toward the exit as if she might still be thrown back out into the cold night. Every bite looked like it might be her last. Fletcher, his patience shredded, moved closer. His voice was tighter now, the smooth veneer of management cracking. "Mr. Washington, I'll ask you again. This is an establishment of standards. You are disturbing the experience of our other clients." Michael didn't move. He simply lifted his gaze, steady and sharp. "Standards," he repeated softly. His fingers tapped once against the tablecloth, a small, deliberate rhythm. "Tell me something, Mr. Fletcher. What are these standards worth if they fail the simplest test of humanity?" Fletcher flushed crimson, his lips pressed thin. "It isn't about humanity. It's about exclusivity. This is not the place for—" But he didn't finish. Margaret Thornfield, with her diamonds flashing under the chandelier, leaned forward in her chair and finished the sentence for him. Her voice carried across the room like a whip. "For her kind." The words landed like stones. Aisha's fork slipped from her fingers, clattering against the plate. She flinched as if struck, her breath catching in her throat. Michael's head turned toward Margaret slowly, too slowly, like a predator deciding whether to strike. His eyes darkened, but his voice was measured, quiet, dangerous. "Her kind?" Margaret lifted her chin, unashamed. "Yes, you know exactly what I mean. That child does not belong here. None of us should have to pay thousands of dollars to eat beside that." She gestured toward Aisha, as though pointing to a stain on the tablecloth. "This is a private establishment, not a charity stage." Every muscle in Aisha's body tightened. She whispered, so softly it nearly broke Michael's heart. Maybe I shouldn't stay." Her eyes watered, and her small hands curled into her lap, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. Michael's hand reached across the table, firm and warm, closing around hers. His voice softened, but it carried through the room like thunder all the same. "Listen to me, Aisha. You did nothing wrong. You belong here more than any of them." The girl blinked up at him, surprised, a flicker of trust breaking through her fear. Michael then turned back to Margaret, his calm mask slipping just enough to show the fire beneath. "You call yourself refined, but refinement without compassion is nothing more than cruelty dressed in silk." His words were precise, cold, yet undeniably powerful. Margaret scoffed, her lips curling in disdain. "Spare us the lecture. You're humiliating yourself. Everyone here can see it." But Michael smiled faintly, though it did not touch his eyes. "On the contrary, madam, what everyone here sees is the truth, and the truth has a way of revealing character." The entire room seemed to lean in, caught in the pull of his words. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, hovering near the walls, watching the exchange unfold like a play. Fletcher, sweating now, tried desperately to take back control. "Mr. Washington, I must insist. If you don't comply, I'll be forced to ask you to leave." Michael set his knife down with surgical precision, the sound sharp against the porcelain. He leaned back in his chair, eyes steady on Fletcher. "Leave?" His voice was calm, but the weight in it pressed against every ear in the room. For what crime? Sharing a meal with a child? Or refusing to bow to the prejudice of a manager and his favored patrons? Gasps whispered across the tables. A man in the back coughed uncomfortably. The entire room knew this had gone further than anyone expected. Margaret, undeterred, gave a brittle laugh. "You can make speeches all you like. It doesn't change what's obvious. That child will never belong here, and neither will you." The words should have wounded, but instead they sharpened Michael's resolve. He looked down at Aisha, who sat clutching the napkin like it was armor, her lips pressed tight, her eyes wet. He reached for her gently, brushing away a tear with the back of his hand. His voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. "Don't let them tell you who you are. You are more than their fear." When he straightened again, his expression had hardened into something the restaurant had never seen from him. Calm was still there, but beneath it was power. Not the kind that flaunted itself in jewelry or money, but the kind that could bend an entire room to silence with one steady stare. And for the first time, Fletcher seemed to realize this wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. The storm had broken open, and Michael Washington was no longer a quiet customer tolerating humiliation. He was something else now, something far more dangerous to the fragile order they had built on arrogance. The real clash had begun. The room had turned into a pressure chamber. Every word spoken seemed to echo louder than it should, every breath heavier than the last. Aisha sat frozen, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes darting nervously between Michael and the angry faces around them. The weight of the room pressed down on her fragile shoulders, as if all of Manhattan's elite had decided she was the problem that needed erasing. Fletcher wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, his voice struggling to hold authority. "Mr. Washington, please. This isn't personal. It's about maintaining the kind of environment our clientele expects. This child, well, clearly she doesn't have the resources to belong here." The word resources slipped out like poison, subtle but unmistakable. A few guests nodded approvingly, as if Fletcher had finally voiced what they were all thinking. Others looked away, pretending not to be complicit in the cruelty. Aisha's lips trembled. She whispered just loudly enough for Michael to hear, "Daddy, does that mean I don't deserve food?" Her question cut through him like glass. Michael leaned forward slowly, folding his napkin with surgical calm. When he looked back up, his expression was unreadable, his voice deceptively quiet. "Resources." He repeated the word, savoring it like it carried a deeper meaning only he understood. Then, without warning, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The motion was deliberate, precise. Every eye in the restaurant followed as he pulled out a sleek black credit card, its surface glinting under the chandelier lights like a blade. He set it on the table with a soft click that echoed louder than a gunshot in the silence. The card was unmistakable. No limit, no ceiling. A symbol reserved for the kind of wealth most people could only dream of. Michael's voice rang clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "Will this car to be sufficient to cover our dinner?" The silence that followed was electric. Fletcher blinked rapidly, caught off guard. His lips parted, then shut again. His eyes darted to the card, recognition flashing instantly. He swallowed hard. "Of course, sir. That isn't the issue." Michael cut him off, his tone sharper now, a blade under silk. "Then resources are not the problem, are they?" A murmur rippled across the tables. Guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that the conversation had turned into a trap. A few looked down at their plates, embarrassed, while others leaned in, drawn by the magnetic pull of conflict. Margaret Thornfield, who had been seething in silence since Michael's last rebuke, could no longer contain herself. "Don't twist words, Mr. Washington. Everyone here knows exactly what this is. You're putting on a performance, pity theater for a child who doesn't belong. This isn't about money, it's about class." Michael turned his head toward her slowly, deliberately, like a lion deciding whether to acknowledge a barking dog. "Class," he repeated softly. "Tell me, madam, what do you believe class is? Diamonds on your neck? A private membership card? Or the way you treat a child who's hungry?" The words struck like lightning. Margaret's face reddened, her mouth opening and closing as though she might argue, but no sound came out. Michael's gaze returned to Fletcher, who stood stiff, sweating, desperate for the conversation to end. "So, let's be clear, Mr. Fletcher. This isn't about money. This isn't about resources. This is about something uglier, something you and your patrons are too comfortable hiding behind words like standards and class. Aisha shifted in her seat, her small hand brushing against his sleeve. Her eyes were wide, her voice a whisper trembling with both fear and wonder. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" Michael looked down at her, and for a brief second his stern expression melted. His voice softened, warm and protective. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. They are..." He picked up the black card again, sliding it back into his jacket with slow precision. His gaze locked onto Fletcher's once more, his tone calm but edged with fire. "You see, I've spent years walking into rooms like this, years being told in 1,000 different ways that I didn't belong, and every time I stayed silent. Every time I let it pass. But silence, Mr. Fletcher, is not weakness. It is patience." The words hung in the air like the slow tightening of a noose. "And patience," Michael continued, his voice low, steady, unshakable, "always runs out." The restaurant was silent now, the kind of silence that comes before the breaking of a storm. Aisha's small figure at his side was no longer just a hungry child. She had become the spark that lit a fire no one in that room was prepared to contain. And for the first time, Fletcher seemed to realize he wasn't dealing with a customer tonight. He was dealing with something far more dangerous. The weight of Michael's last words still hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Guests who had once laughed over wine now sat stiff, unsure where to look. Even the waiter who had delivered Aisha's golden fish stood frozen in the corner, tray clutched to his chest, his eyes flicking nervously between his manager and the man who had just dismantled him with a credit card and a sentence. Aisha ate in small bites, her hand trembling every time she raised her fork. The food was exquisite, yet she glanced around constantly, as if the meal might be snatched away at any second. Her lips parted once, as though she wanted to thank him again, but the weight of so many staring eyes pressed her words back down. Margaret Thornfield was the first to break the silence. Her laugh was brittle, shrill, and meant to cut. "This is pitiful," she declared, her voice rising above the stillness. "We all know what's happening here. A stunt. A scene. He drags in a child from the street, calls her a princess, waves around his card, and thinks it makes him noble. But let's stop pretending, Mr. Washington. She isn't yours. She'll never be yours." The words hit Aisha like a blow. Her fork clattered to her plate, her shoulders curling inward, her eyes filling with tears she tried desperately to hold back. She whispered, barely audible, "Daddy, maybe I should go." Michael's hand moved instantly, covering hers, steady and strong. His thumb brushed away the fear trembling through her fingers. His voice was quiet, but it carried a force that pulled the entire room back into silence. "No, sweetheart, you are exactly where you're meant to be." He lifted his head then, and for the first time that night, his composure cracked open, not into anger, but into something sharper. His gaze swept across Margaret, across Fletcher, across the tables of staring faces. He let the silence build until the room leaned forward, waiting. "You're right," Michael said finally, his tone calm, his words deliberate. "Aisha is not my biological daughter." A ripple moved through the restaurant. Gasps, shocked whispers, the sharp intake of breath from those who thought Margaret had won. Margaret's lips curled into a triumphant smirk. Fletcher exhaled with visible relief, convinced the man had just undermined himself. But Michael wasn't finished. He placed his free hand over Aisha's tiny fingers, holding them firmly, as if anchoring her to the earth itself. His voice rose now, clear, steady, leaving no space for doubt. "She is my daughter by choice, my daughter by love, my daughter by law. We finalized the adoption papers last week." The words detonated like a bomb in the dining hall. The silence that followed was no ordinary quiet. It was shock, disbelief, the kind that grips an entire room by the throat. Aisha gasped, her eyes widening, her lips trembling. She turned to him, searching his face as though afraid she'd misheard. "You mean, really?" Michael looked at her then, not at the gawking patrons, not at the sweating manager, not at the furious socialite, just at her. His expression softened into something that melted every wall she had ever built against the world. "Really, you are mine, my daughter, from now on, forever." The first tear slipped down her cheek, and she didn't hide it this time. She whispered the word with trembling wonder, tasting it like it was the most precious thing she had ever been given. "Daddy!" The sound of it was like thunder. Several patrons flinched visibly. A man dropped his fork with a sharp clatter. Someone else muttered a curse under their breath, but there was no denying what had just been spoken into existence. Michael leaned back slightly, his eyes sweeping the room once more, his voice now carrying the kind of authority that came not from power or money, but from undeniable truth. You see, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a performance. This is family. And if family offends you, perhaps the problem isn't at this table. Perhaps the problem is staring back at you in the mirror. Fletcher staggered back a step, his composure unraveling. Margaret's smirk collapsed into shock, her hand trembling against her wineglass. The other patrons sat frozen, caught between outrage and the gnawing awareness that they were witnessing a moment that would not stay hidden within these walls. Because for the first time, they understood. This wasn't about dinner anymore. This was about something far larger. And Michael Washington had just revealed his opening move, the sickness-side. Lens that followed Michael's declaration was not simple quiet. It was the stunned hush of a world that had just shifted. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even the flicker of the candles seemed to pause, as if the restaurant itself were holding its breath. Aisha sat frozen in her chair, her wide eyes searching his face, as though to confirm what she had just heard. When she whispered "Daddy" again, soft but steady, the sound cracked through the air like thunder. The word was fragile, but it carried the weight of belonging, the weight of something the world had always denied her. Margaret Thornfield looked as if the ground had been ripped out from under her. The smug curve of her lips had vanished, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped panic. Fletcher blinked rapidly, his throat working, his face gleaming with nervous sweat. For years he had toyed with this customer, dismissing him with slow service, sneers, and false mistakes. Now, every one of those moments seemed to echo back at him in the eyes of the man who had just claimed the girl as his daughter. And then Michael's phone, resting discreetly by his plate, buzzed once. He glanced down at the screen. A single text had appeared from his personal assistant. Operation Cleanup, ready. Michael's lips curved into the faintest smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He picked up the phone and typed 2 words, "Proceed now." Moments later, the heavy front doors of the restaurant opened. A man in a charcoal suit strode in, carrying a slim leather briefcase. Behind him, 2 others followed, one with the stiff authority of law, the other with the steady stride of media. The first man stopped just inside the golden glow of the chandeliers, his voice crisp and clear. "Good evening, David Chun, legal representative for Washington Tech Holdings." The name alone sent a ripple of murmurs through the room. Several guests turned to each other in confusion, some recognizing the company instantly. Others merely sensed the weight behind the introduction. Fletcher's face drained of color. Mr. Chun, this is highly irregular." David ignored him. He walked straight to Michael's table, bowing his head briefly before setting the briefcase down. He opened it with calm precision, pulling out a stack of neatly bound files, a tablet, and a small audio recorder. His voice was steady, professional, but carried an edge of satisfaction. "As per your instructions, Mr. Washington, all documentation is complete. 4 years of evidence, incidents cataloged, recordings transcribed, witness statements gathered. Shall I?" Michael inclined his head slightly. "Go ahead." David pressed a button on the recorder, and the room filled with Fletcher's voice. "We must maintain an atmosphere for a certain clientele." The words, spoken barely 15 minutes earlier, replayed in crisp clarity. Gasps rippled through the dining hall as every guest recognized the venom in the tone, the discrimination wrapped in polite language. Margaret stiffened in her chair, her eyes darting wildly. Another clip followed. Fletcher again, weeks earlier. "Table for him. Put them in the back corner. Let's keep the front tables for the real customers." Then another. "Don't bother rushing the order. He'll wait. They always wait." Each phrase was a dagger, replayed in the pristine acoustics of the elegant dining room. The guests who had once nodded along to Fletcher's dismissals now sat rigid, their faces blanching as they realized every whisper had been captured. Then a different voice, Margaret's. "We don't pay these prices to dine beside these people. It's embarrassing." The playback was merciless, every syllable coded in disdain, every word now undeniable. Margaret's hands trembled, her wineglass tipping enough to spill crimson liquid across the pristine tablecloth. She scrambled to blot it with her napkin, but nothing could blot out the recording that hung in the air. Michael sat still, his face calm, his hand resting lightly on Aisha's shoulder. She leaned against him now, her small body trembling, but her eyes wide with awe. For once, she wasn't the one being silenced. For once, the room wasn't laughing at her expense. David spoke again, his voice crisp. "Every recording has been transcribed and notarized. The pattern is undeniable. 4 years of systemic discrimination by this establishment, led and enforced by current management." He turned toward Fletcher, his expression cool. You have built your career on exclusion, Mr. Fletcher. Tonight, it ends. The manager staggered back a step, his composure shattering. This is entrapment. You can't... Michael finally rose from his chair. He towered over the table now, his presence filling the room, his voice resonant and steady. You mistake me, Mr. Fletcher. This isn't entrapment. This is exposure. The guests sat in silence, watching the scene unfold, their meals forgotten. Some looked guilty, recalling their own whispers over the years. Others looked horrified, realizing they were witnessing the death of an empire of arrogance. Michael looked down at Aisha, brushing a curl from her face with gentle fingers. Then he turned back to Fletcher, his voice carrying like iron wrapped in velvet. This restaurant has thrived on silence. My silence. The silence of every customer you made feel small. Tonight, that silence breaks. And in the stunned quiet that followed, the walls of Le Bernardin no longer felt unshakable. They felt like they were beginning to crumble. The restaurant had become a courtroom. Every guest sat like a silent juror, every breath heavy, every whisper buried under the echo of those damning recordings. Fletcher stood pale, his jaw slack, his hand clutching the back of a chair as though it might keep him upright. Margaret Thornfield's diamonds no longer gleamed with pride. They hung heavy on her neck like chains, her fingers trembling as she tried to grip her glass. Michael stood tall, his hand resting protectively on Aisha's shoulder. He was calm, but it was the kind of calm that unnerved, the kind that came not from restraint, but from certainty. He adjusted his cufflinks with unhurried precision, the room hanging on even the smallest flick of his wrist. David Chun closed the briefcase and looked to him. Everything is in place, sir. The documents are ready for delivery. Michael nodded once. Good. Then he turned his gaze on Fletcher, who swallowed hard, trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. This is outrageous, the manager stammered. Mr. Washington, if you have complaints, there are channels, corporate channels, to handle such matters. You cannot humiliate us like this in front of our guests. Michael leaned forward slightly, his hands pressed against the table, his voice steady and cold. Humiliate you? No, Mr. Fletcher. I'm educating you. There's a difference. He straightened, reaching for the leather briefcase David had left on the chair beside him. From it, he pulled a slim folder embossed with gold lettering. He placed it on the table, sliding it toward Fletcher with deliberate slowness. Read it. Fletcher frowned, his hands trembling as he opened the folder. His eyes skimmed the words and widened in shock. His lips moved as he whispered the text aloud, disbelief dripping from every syllable. Transfer of ownership, Washington Tech Holdings, deed of property. He looked up, his voice cracking. This says you. Michael's gaze was like steel. Yes, I own this building, every inch of it, including this restaurant. I acquired it 3 months ago. The revelation detonated in the room. Gasps rang out. Someone choked on their wine. A waiter dropped a tray, the crash echoing through the stunned silence. Guests turned in their seats, staring at Michael as if seeing him for the first time. Fletcher staggered backward, the folder slipping from his fingers, pages scattering across the marble floor. No, that's impossible. Impossible? Michael asked, his voice cutting clean through the panic. No, Mr. Fletcher, I've been preparing this for years. While you were busy enforcing your standards, I was documenting them. While you humiliated black customers, delayed their meals, dismissed their presence, I was buying the very ground beneath your feet. He lifted another document from the folder, holding it up for the nearest guests to see. It bore the seal of the city registrar, stamped and authenticated. As of 3 months ago, Washington Tech Holdings became the legal owner of this property. All leases and contracts now pass through me. Margaret lurched to her feet, her voice shrill. You can't. That's absurd. You're staging this. Michael turned his gaze on her, his eyes narrowing. Staging? Madam, the only performance here is your outrage. But the audience, he gestured around the room, seems unimpressed. Laughter didn't follow, only silence. A silence that cut Margaret deeper than ridicule ever could. Michael's voice rose slightly, deliberate, carrying through every corner of the room. As of Monday, there will be administrative changes, new policies, new management, and every single employee who participated in racial discrimination, every sneer, every whisper, every deliberate act of exclusion will be terminated for cause. Fletcher's knees nearly buckled. Terminated? You can't fire me. I've been here 15 years. Michael stepped closer, towering over him, his calmness more terrifying than anger. 15 years perpetuating prejudice. 15 years making families feel unwelcome. 15 years believing silence meant approval. That ends tonight. Aisha, watching wide-eyed, tugged at his sleeve. Her voice was timid, yet filled with awe. "Daddy, you really own this place?" Michael's features softened instantly when he looked down at her. He bent slightly, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Yes, sweetheart. And you know what that means? It means you'll never have to feel out of place here again. This place belongs to you as much as it does to me." A small, shaky smile spread across her face, the kind of smile that carried years of hunger, pain, and hope all at once. She clutched his hand tightly, her eyes shining as she whispered, "Like a real princess." Michael's chest tightened, his voice warm as he answered, "Exactly, just like a real princess." He straightened again, his gaze sweeping the room one last time. His voice was quiet, but its power reverberated like thunder. "For years you've mistaken silence for weakness. Tonight you learn the truth. Patience is power, and now the reckoning begins." The room sat frozen, the chandeliers casting cold light on faces stripped bare of arrogance. Fletcher's career, Margaret's reputation, the restaurant's false grandeur, it was all unraveling right before their eyes, and it was only the beginning. The restaurant no longer felt like a temple of elegance. The chandeliers still glittered, the silver still shone, but beneath the polished surface, everything had changed. Guests who once spoke with smug assurance now sat hushed, their eyes lowered or locked on Michael Washington, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath their feet. The balance of power had been rewritten in a matter of minutes, and the man they had underestimated now stood as master of the stage. Aisha sat close beside him, her fork resting on the plate, her appetite caught between fear and awe. She looked up at him, her voice quiet enough that only he could hear. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" The question pierced him deeper than Margaret's insults, deeper than Fletcher's contempt. He turned, crouching down so his eyes met hers directly. His expression softened, every line of tension easing into tenderness. He brushed a curl away from her forehead, his voice steady and warm. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. We're exactly where we're supposed to be." Her small fingers clutched his sleeve, needing reassurance. "But everyone's looking at us." Michael smiled faintly, tilting his head toward the staring crowd. "Let them. Sometimes the world needs to look, to see what it tries so hard to ignore." His voice dropped lower, meant only for her. "And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit tall, even when people want you to disappear." Her eyes shimmered with tears, but she nodded slowly, drawing courage from his words. Michael rose again, his hand never leaving hers. He turned back to the guests, his voice steady, filling every corner of the restaurant. "You see, tonight is not about humiliation, it's about truth, and truth has a way of showing us who we really are." He let his gaze settle on Fletcher, who stood pale and trembling, and then on Margaret, whose trembling hands could no longer keep hold of her wine glass. For years, this place has thrived on exclusion. People paid for the privilege of pretending they were better than others. But true excellence, he said, pausing, was never about exclusion. It has always been about inclusion. A murmur rippled through the crowd, some faces flushed with shame, others with the raw sting of realization. Michael lifted his chin, his tone ringing with clarity. "As of Monday, Le Bernardin will no longer be a monument to arrogance. It will be transformed into a place where dignity is non-negotiable. Every employee will undergo training on discrimination. Every guest will be welcomed, not measured. And one table, every night, will be reserved for families who otherwise could never afford to sit here." The words dropped like stones into a still pond, spreading ripples of astonishment through the room. A few guests shifted, ashamed. A waiter's eyes brightened for the first time all evening. Even the pianist, hands resting on the keys, looked up in quiet admiration. "Mish." AL's voice softened, but it carried no less power. Because if a child has the courage to walk barefoot into a place where she's told she doesn't belong, then the least we can do is make sure she never has to ask again. Aisha blinked up at him, her lips parting in wonder. "Really, Daddy? A table for people like me?" He crouched again, his eyes warm, his tone gentle but sure. "Yes, sweetheart. For people exactly like you. For princesses who need to be reminded of who they are." Her smile broke then, small, trembling, but radiant. And when she whispered, "Like a real princess," the room felt it. The words weren't childish fancy, they were truth. Michael stood once more, his hand firm on her shoulder, his gaze sweeping the restaurant. "That is the promise I make tonight, not just to her, but to every child who has ever been told they don't belong." The silence that followed wasn't hostile now. It was heavy, reflective. Guests looked at him not with disdain, but with something they hadn't felt before, respect, reluctant but undeniable. And in that moment, Le Bernardin was no longer theirs. It was his. 6 months later, the restaurant no longer looked like the same place. The chandeliers still glowed, the tables still gleamed with white linen, and the plates still carried dishes that could make even the most jaded diner pause in awe. But beneath the glitter and shine, the air itself had changed. The cold, invisible wall that once pressed against certain guests was gone. In its place was warmth, welcome, dignity. The transformation was impossible to miss. A corner table, the same corner where Aisha once sat trembling, was now reserved every night, not for bankers, not for socialites, but for families who never thought they'd set foot in a place like this. A single mother in a cotton dress, a father with his 2 kids, a grandmother holding her granddaughter's hand. These were the guests who sat at that table. They came nervous, sometimes ashamed, but they always left smiling, their eyes shining with something money couldn't buy: belonging. The waitstaff moved differently now, no longer stiff and watchful, but kind, attentive, proud. The music felt lighter, the air softer, and every guest who dined there knew they weren't just paying for a meal anymore. They were paying to be part of something larger, something meaningful. From his office window above the restaurant, Michael Washington watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. He had kept his promise. Le Bernardin was no longer a fortress of exclusion. It was proof that patience, when it breaks, can rebuild a world. A soft laugh pulled him from his thoughts. Across the street in the park, Aisha ran through the grass in her new school uniform, her braids bouncing as she chased after a ball. Her backpack, shiny, sturdy, brand new, rested on the bench beside her. She looked like every other child now, but to him, she was extraordinary. She noticed him watching and waved, her smile stretching wide. "Daddy!" she called, her voice carrying across the park. Michael smiled, a smile that this time reached his eyes. He walked down the steps, crossing the street to her. She ran into his arms, small hands clutching his suit jacket, her laughter warm against his chest. They sat together on the bench, and for a while the world around them seemed to fall away. Aisha swung her legs, her shoes polished, her eyes bright. After a moment, her voice turned thoughtful. "Daddy, why were they so mean to us that night?" Michael inhaled slowly, the memory of Fletcher's sneer, Margaret's venom, the weight of all those years pressing at the edges of his mind. He looked at her, his voice gentle, deliberate. "Because they were afraid, sweetheart. Afraid to see the truth, that they weren't better than anyone else." She thought about it, her small brow furrowing before nodding slowly. "Grandma always said people act mean when they're scared." Michael kissed the top of her head. She was right. But remember this, you never have to live by their fear. You live by your worth, and your worth is endless. Her smile returned, brighter this time, radiant. "Like a princess," she whispered. He chuckled softly. "No, not like a princess." He lifted her chin gently, meeting her eyes. "You are one." Across town, Thomas Fletcher stood behind the checkout counter of a small grocery store, his once polished shoes scuffed, his tie gone, his name tag crooked. Customers barely looked at him. The man who once sneered at others now bagged groceries, his fall from grace complete. Margaret Thornfield sat in her penthouse, curtains drawn, her phone buzzing with silence. The video of her venomous words, replayed millions of times across social media, had stripped her of her friends, her fortune, her reputation. The diamonds that once announced her power now mocked her in the mirror. But in the heart of Manhattan, a barefoot girl who once whispered, "Can I eat with you, Daddy?" now walked proudly into her new school each morning, her head high, her heart secure. And every night at Le Bernardin, the corner table stood as a quiet monument, not to exclusion, not to privilege, but to a promise kept, that dignity would never again be denied to anyone who walked through those doors. Michael held his daughter's hand as they crossed the street together, the city lights shimmering above them. For the first time in his life, he felt not just powerful, not just successful, but whole. And for the first time in hers, Aisha felt safe. Because the greatest power wasn't the black card, the ownership papers, or the title of CEO. The greatest power was love, the kind that rewrites destinies, silences prejudice, and teaches a little girl she was always more than enough.